In Vilna, in 1848, there was a raging epidemic of the cholera plague. Now, epidemics in Klal Yisrael's long and storied history have been very deadly events, obviously for forever. What we recently endured of COVID was nothing, pales by comparison to the incredible epidemics and epidemics and destruction that Klal Yisrael suffered through. Obviously, since the times of the Mishnah in Tainus and the second parak writes that if there's dever, if there's a epidemic and people are dying, so we're geyser a Tainus for the tzibur, and it's gebracht in Shulchan Aruch, and Tafkol Fayin Vav. This is a din lemaisa, and there's obviously a lot that's been said about plagues and v'chulu. Now, in 1848, the cholera plague was raging through Vilna, and it was killing many, many people. And how exactly to deal with it and how to stay safe was something that was getting better over time, but they still had not perfected. And they became a big shaila as Yom Kippur was approaching of that year. What should be the posture of the Rabbanim, of the Talmidei Chacham in Vilna in regards to fasting on Yom Kippur? Obviously, someone who's ill and would be endangered by fasting is really a din pashat in Shulchan Aruch, that he's not mechuyev to fast in Yom Kippur. But the question became as to what should be the policy, the posture, the public posture for the entire tzibur at large. Now, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, of the famous founder of the Muslim movement, was a man with iron will. The only way that a single individual could transform the entire yeshiva system, granted over time, and it took generations for members of his Talmidim, the Talmidei Talmidav, and Talmidei Talmidav to penetrate and integrate in the yeshiva system. But Rabbi Yisroel Salanter's sheer will to introduce a new idea and a new ideal into Klal Yisrael requires a tremendous strength of character. So Rabbi Yisroel Salanter had a tremendous Korah Barzel in strength of character. Now this story takes place while Rabbi Yisroel Salanter is not even 40 yet. I believe he's 38 years old or 39 years old at the time that this plague is happening in 1848. He's living in the city of Vilna. He is a simple balabas. Granted, those who know that he's a Talmud Chacham, they know that he's a Goyin, they know that his father was a famous Goyin, although his father also did not hold any shteller until very late in his life, possibly till the end of his life. A pattern Rabbi Yisroel followed. He also didn't hold a shteller, a formal Rabbanish shteller, but it was known that Rabbi Yisroel Lipkin was a Talmud Chacham, a Goyin, but he was living there as a private citizen, as an individual in Vilna in the year 1848. Now, as Yom Kippur rolled around this season, Rabbi Yisroel and this plague was raging through Vilna. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter stepped up in an incredible way. And I want to tell that story about Rabbi Yisroel Salanter's stepping up in this situation and the great halachic dispute that ensued following his psak. So now, just to wind back the clock a little bit, Rabbi Yisroel was a private individual, not a rich man, a simple householder in the city of Vilna at the time. And when the plague struck, and this unfortunately was not so uncommon, plague would circle back around from time to time, Rabbi Yisroel surprisingly decided to take it upon himself, above all the community leaders, above all the Rabbanim and etc., to run urgent care of sorts, a field hospital, to help these victims of the plague. And in the Svarim that document Rabbi Yisroel's life, and this is pretty reliable stuff, and a good portion of it comes from his son, who was a Rav, in his son Rabbi Yitzchak, who became a Rav in various Litvish cities, who wrote in the Hatfuna, which was like a chiveres that the Musar movement put out, and he wrote the recollections that he had of his father. So a lot of this comes from pretty first-hand information, first-hand knowledge. Rabbi Yisroel fundraised and put together a field hospital that had 1,500 beds, which is an incredible number, an incredible feat, an accomplishment that Rabbi Yisroel was able to put together to furnish Vilna with this incredible help in its great time of need. Now, Rabbi Yisroel, being the tremendous Baal B'tachon and Baal Amunah that he was, he refused to fundraise for long time ahead of what he needed. So Rabbi Yisroel would fundraise a few days worth of money, and then eventually he would stop, and then they would get to a tight spot again. He would fundraise again. He was even in this great time of dedication that he was committing to over here. He still did not neglect his ideals of Emunah. Now eventually, a gvir by the name of Aptov, who must have been a known gvir in Vilna at the time, was maskim he pledged to give meat and candle, firewood for the whole time that the hospital will be up. Originally, Rabbi Yisroel's son writes that Rabbi Yisroel refused to accept it from him. This man had to beg for the schus to be able to do this long term, and Rabbi Yisroel was finally maskim. Now, So Yisroel has this field hospital, this temporary urgent care that he opened up in Vilna. Now, additionally, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, I think people don't know this, might have been from the founder of Hatzalah. He put together a group of 60, 70 young men. It sounds like they were probably Bachrim still. Yireim v'loimdim, his son writes, they were learned and had Yireh Shamayim, and he made them shifts, that they should all be prepared to bring, emergency aid to anybody who would call. So somebody would send a message that, someone in their household is sick or ill or needs some assistance. And a group of these strong, young, fit, healthy young men who are on duty would go rescue this person and bring him to the hospital and do whatever was needed. And Rabbi Yisroel was the Psak for this nascent group of Hatzalah, and he told them exactly what to be makel on. And in the different svarim that recount this event, it says that Rabbi Yisroel was extremely makel in all in Yanei Shabbos and etc. as needed. Or the way a Brisker would say it, he was machmer and safek pikuach nefesh to make sure that anybody who needed would get the aid that they needed. Eventually, his son writes, just a story, I'll share this. His son writes that one of the elder chshuvim in Vilna, Rabbi Yosef Chalfan, I don't know anything about him. Someone in his household got sick, and they sent a message to the urgent care. Yisroel sent a few of his bachrim down, and they quickly started lighting a fire, and they prepared, and they made tea, and they fed the kid, and they took care of everything. After Shabbos was over, this zaken came to Rabbi Yisroel, and he tells him, "I want to thank you, Rabbi Yisroel, that you saved my grandson's life, but I do need to tell you that you're a little bit too makel when it comes to Chilul Shabbos." And the Yisroel's son writes that he was there, he witnessed this, and he says he does not remember ever seeing his father get angry like this. And he says his father, Yisroel, looked at this elder Adam Chashiv from Vilna, and he said to him in Yiddish, "Tu prastaktu, you idiot, you. I took 60, 70 bachrim from their parents, and I promised their parents that I'll return them hale and healthy. Who are you to tell me what's needed to be done over here?" Meaning, Rabbi Yisroel was saying, I was I got involved in this incredibly complex situation. I know the circumstance that's going on over here, and I was machlet that these are the coolest that are needed. You shouldn't be telling me what to do. And these stories are an incredible testament to Rabbi Yisroel's willpower. Now, in any case, this was his general involvement in the plague. Now, as the calendar was turning into Tafshin Tes, so the shaila became, should they fast on Yom Kippur or not? Now, Rabbi Yisroel himself, according to the different people who were involved in it, was unsure. He deliberated back and forth. He was extremely unsure what the right thing to do. Should they fast? Should they not fast? Until finally, the day before Yom Kippur, Rabbi Yisroel was machlit that it would not be appropriate for anybody to fast. It would be too dangerous. And Rabbi Yisroel hired a pachkevilan hanger, a printer, and a pachkevilan hanger, and he said, "Please go hang around signs all around town that say that al pi hiras Rabbi Yisroel Lipkin." Rabbi Yisroel Lipkin Hamachunas Salanter, I am mitzaveh and poisik for everybody in the town of Vilna that they should not fast in Yom Kippur. Everybody means everybody, not only people who are sick. I mean mitzaveh that nobody should fast in Yom Kippur this year. Now the streets were aflame. This is a tremendous tumult because Rabbi Yisroel was 38 or 39 years old. Granted, he was an Eloi, a Tam Chacham, and Adam Chashiv, but he wasn't the poisik of the city. Vilna had poiskim, Vilna had rabbanim, led by the venerated senior Rav Rabbi Tzal Akayin, the Mechaber of the Sefer Reishis Bikurim, who we've spoken about in the past, and many, many other Chashiv Dayanim and Rabbanim, and this was a big tumult. Hayitachin that this, basically Yungaman should be Paisik, Yungaman who's not even the Dayan of Vilna should be Paisik for everybody to not fast, and the tumult was going on. Now Rabbi Yisroel, hearing that there was a tumult, and that what he said was not niskabel hands down, he decided to take a dramatic step to escalate this and make sure that his psak was seen through. And Rabbi Yisroel did something incredible. He went, and this is retold by many of the different svarim of the day. Rabbi Yisroel's son brings it. It's brought down in a sefer from I forgot his name, Yaakov Mark. He's like a very interesting sefer. It was originally published in Yiddish, Gedolim von unserer Zeit, and then they later translated it into Hebrew, B'mechitzasam shel Gedolei Hadar. It's available. You could look it up. It's brought down from other people, Rav Shimon Strashin, Rishon Salanter's son, the Makar Baruch brings it, the Torah Tamima, etc. It's brought down from many, many Makaris. So even though there are those who are mafakvik on it and say that this didn't happen, many, many contemporaries who lived in Yisroel's day and were close to him write that it did happen. So we're going to go the route that it did. And that is, they say that Rabbi Yisroel went to the big shul in Vilna, the main shul, where all the Chashav Rabbanim and Dayanim were davening, and right after Kriyas HaTorah, before Musaf, Rabbi Yisroel stepped up to the bima with a becher and some mezainis. And Yeshomer, he brought 2 dayanim with him. Others say that he did not. And Rabbi Yisroel gave a clap on the bima. He made kiddush on the becher. He said kiddush, and then he promptly made a mezainis and ate a shtickle mezainis over there. And he said, "Look, I don't have cholera. I was just broke my fast now because it's not safe for anybody to be fasting, and I'm encouraging all of you to do the same." Legend has it that someone in the crowd, an older yid, called out, "Does Vilna not have rabbanim? How you talking for you to step up and do this? Who are you?" And again, according to some recountings, Rabbi Tzalel Akayin, the elderly Rav of Vilna at the time, a man who was much, much more senior to Rabbi Yisroel, climbed his way up to the bima. He gave a clap on the bima and he said, "I'm moicha. Rabbi Yisroel's wrong. Metadus nishtan." And he was moicha. But Rabbi Yisroel stood there. He fought through it, and he convinced group by group to come up and make kiddush and have mezainis and break their fasts. So that Rabbi Yisroel single-handedly forced the Kehillah in Vilna to do this, and then he continued going from shul to shul, telling them over what had transpired and getting them to come along as well. So Rabbi Yisroel forced a good portion of Vilna that year to not fast. Now, obviously, this was far from over, and the tumult raged on. The Bezdin was furious, the Rabbanim were furious, I'm sure there were plenty of people who were furious, and the tumult raged on. Now here, there's several different nakudas, interesting legends. I might as well just say the story before we go into the Shaila. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, in his Sefer on Orach Chaim and Emes Yaakov, he brings down that he heard it from the Chafetz Chaim. He heard this from the Chafetz Chaim, that the Bezdin of Vilna called Rabbi Yisroel in and said, "Rabbi Yisroel, you're a Talmud Chacham, you're a chashav person, but l'maisi you're mechuyev and einish. The Bezdin must punish you for what you're doing over here. So instead of us deciding how we should punish you, why don't you tell us what you think is an appropriate punishment?" And Rabbi Yaakov says that Rabbi Yisroel turned to them and he said, "If you're not going to let this go and let me go and not belabor this anymore, then I'm going to passel all the gittin that this Bezdin of Vilna made." And they said, "What do you mean you're going to passel all the gittin?" He said, "You, Kayidua, the Bezdin of Vilna, makes a get, Yisayimach on a Beis Shmuel. I have a bomb kasha on the Beis Shmuel that Yisayimach on. You're not going to be able to answer the kasha, and if I'm a farce on this, it's going to passel all you gittin." They said, "No, so let's see what's the kasha." Rabbi Yisroel told them the kasha, and the kasha was something they couldn't answer, and Rabbi Yisroel said, "So let's call it a draw. If you don't back off and allow me my deference, I'm gonna slug up this all the gittin over here." And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Amos Yaakov explains that obviously Rabbi Yisroel knew the answer to the question, because otherwise he'd be mechuyev lefarsim this issue. Obviously Rabbi Yisroel knew that the kasha wasn't a kasha; he just knew that they wouldn't have the answer to the question. And he says, but Lamaisi says, why didn't Rabbi Yisroel ask them? So he said Rabbi Yisroel must have held that just the Yerushalmi that's gebracht in the Poskim that says that if someone asks a shayla by pikuach nefesh, a harezim maguna, it's disgusting. Rabbi Yisroel held this was included in the harezim maguna. He can't let this become something that was a big need and a big shayla. He knew it wouldn't come out the way he wanted to, and it's b'makom pikuach nefesh, a shayla maguna. So Rabbi Yisroel didn't want to ask. Now, obviously the Bezdin didn't punish him, but this Vaita didn't end off the fight, and Rabbi Yisroel heard more tumult, more rash. The people in the street are still tumbling. What's this psak? What's this thing that Rabbi Yisroel did? So he announced that on Cholamayid Sukkos he's going to give a shir in the big shul. He didn't say what the topic was, but obviously the Olam presumed that Rabbi Yisroel was going to be in defense of his psak, and he was going to explain. And the place was milami payal pay. It was filled to the rafters. Everybody who's anybody in Vilna wanted to come here. Rabbi Yisroel Salanta's defense of his very, very incredible and chiddush psak. They pile into the Beis Medrash, and Rabbi Yisroel said shir on a random topic in the Gaon Ma'alis. He said a shvera shir and a shvera inyan. But legend had it in Vilna that Yana shir that Rabbi Yisroel said was so impressive and so above and beyond what was the norm, that even Rabbi Yisrael's biggest detractors were forced to say, "Oh, this is another gadol, and he's entitled to his opinion." Now, according to some, this fight still was unsettled, and Rabbi Yisrael ultimately leaves Vilna. He goes to Kovna, where he opens a Beis HaMusar, and from there to Halberstadt in Germany, and then from there to many, many other places. Rabbi Yisrael was a little bit itinerant towards the second half of his life, and in an ironic twist of hashkacha, Rabbi Yisrael does end up back in Vilna many years later, 30 years later, while there's another cholera plague, and his wife, Rabbi Yisrael's wife, dies in the cholera epidemic. 30 years later in Vilna, which is an ironic postscript to the story. Now, in any case, this was the incredible shaila that transpired in Vilna at the time. And let's talk a little bit the Inyan, the tzad heter over here. So now, the most basic way to look at this is as follows. There's a Magen Avram in Siman Taf Kuf Ayin Vav in Shulchan Aruch. When the Shulchan Aruch says that when there's dever in the city, when there's a plague that runs through a city, we're mechuyev to fast, the Magen Avram Afanard over there says as follows. He says, Ha'idna, ein misan in klal b'shas hadever. These days, the Magen Avram says, we don't fast anymore b'shas hadever. It's in Sifkat and Beis, and Tavkaf Ayin Vav Sifkat and Beis. Shas hadever, the menusa hu k'she'enu oichel v'shoyse koilet chas v'shalom shinei aver. Because it's badik menusa, we know that anybody who doesn't eat and drink at a time when there's bad air, meaning there's microbes floating around that could get you sick, is more susceptible to illness and could become more sick. So the Magen Avraham is saying over there that even though Apidina de Gemara is a chiyuv to make a tainus when there's plague around, but bismanenu, we don't fast anymore when there's a plague. Now granted, the Magen Avraham is not talking about Yom Kippur, he's not even talking about any of the other tainesim, he's talking about the additional extra tainus that we're supposed to make. But if you take a look in the Chuvas of the Chasam Sefer, in Chelik Vav and Chuvah Chav Gimel, the Chasam Sefer over there is writing a shayla regarding Achila b'Yom Kippur b'Zman Magefa, and the Chasam Sefer brings as follows. It's the shayla is as follows: Al nidin dibarte roife mumche ha'imrim hayotzim mipesach beisei aliber rekanos b'yom hataynis dame benafshay. This, that it's known that the doctor said that anybody who leaves his house with an empty stomach during this tkufa on the tainus is dame b'roishay. He's inviting death upon himself. B'idin rischa magefas kalar rachman al-tzlan. Mistapik ma'yehi b'yom tzemir rabba. Hashem Yasser Charone Virapa Kol Chel Yam Yisrael Mehera. This is the shayla. Because everyone wants to know what should be on Yom Kippur. If the doctors are saying that anybody who leaves his house is in danger, what should be on Yom Kippur? So he brings right away from the Chuvas Dvar Shmuel, Reb Shmuel Abuav, and Simon Kov Zayin, who says is Mate Reb Shitos, for an Isha who's nursing, she's totally healthy, but her baby could become ill if she fasts. So the Dvar Shmuel is Mate that she's allowed to not fast, so that her baby doesn't become ill. Because why? Because it's considered pikuach nefesh. If she's going to risk it, her baby could go into danger. He says the Dvar Shmuel brings no rayas to this. So you see that this is a davar pashut, that just like a regular healthy person is allowed to be mechal Shabbos to save someone who's in shas sakana. So kal v'chomer over here, you're allowed to save yourself from going into shas sakana. He says just like as anyone who's involved in atzalas nefashis, they're not ill, and yet they're allowed to be mechal Shabbos to save anybody. Kal v'chomer to save yourself so that you don't become in danger, you're allowed to. Then he says he just has a wrinkle over here. But Lamaisa, the Reifim said, only if you leave the doors. So he says, maybe just stay inside, don't daven with the minion, skip everything, and everything will be fine. That's Psak. He brings this, then he says he brings this Magen Avram in Siman Taf Kuf Ayin Vav, and he says, Vaistois, that it's dangerous always, and therefore says the Chasam Sefer, you could eat and drink, and he instructs how to do shiurim, and etc. But he says that someone, even a healthy person, during the Shas Magefa, has to be afraid that he could potentially catch this Magefa, and therefore he's allowed to be mekel. And Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, l'chayrik Pshutai, was being semich on this Magen Avram and this Chasam Sefer to say that since, even though there's a fully healthy population in Vilna at the time, but hayos, the illness rages outside and it's possible for anybody to catch it at any moment, therefore it's mutter even for totally people who are briim to eat and not fast in Yom Kippur because we don't want them to get sick. It's considered a suffix sakana that they might get sick. And Taka in Reb Moshe and Igis Moshe in I forget which Chelik of Archaim, but in Igris Moshe he writes about a Chayla who is not in Sakana yet, but should he fast, it could cause him to go into Sakana. And Moshe likewise is Mekel, and says that such a person is allowed to not fast, even though currently he's not in danger at all. He brings a raya from a sugi in Shabbos, and then he also at the end of it he cites, and I'll read it, he says, V'yadua, Sha'goyin Rabbi Yisroel Salanter zal, Tziva b'shah shayimachla ha'kalora ha'misvashetes. I would venture to say this is probably the only time Rabbi Moshe quotes Rabbi Yisroel, maybe ever, but for sure, lahalacha l'maisa. He says he was mitzaveh at the time when there was cholera, lechel b'yem k'purim kol b'nei ha'ir. He allowed everybody in the city to eat, mishum shel re'evim yoser olul is davik bem. Because for the re'evim, those who are hungry, it's more likely that they could become attacked by the plague and catch it. Even though they were totally healthy at the time, so that they shouldn't become sick. So Ramesh seems to be clearly understanding Rabbi Yisroel Salanter that Rabbi Yisrael was makel because of this Chasam Sefer, this Magen Avram, this precedent that says that any time a healthy person could become in danger from fasting, we're makel for him when we say you don't have to fast in that circumstance. Now, it happens to be that there's another knech in this nidin. Rav Shlomo Zalman in Halicha Shleima brings that he always heard the story, but Rabbi Eli Lapian told him that Rabbi Yisrael himself didn't eat on this day. Only he was makel for other people, meaning Rabbi Yisrael wanted to really drive home the kula that anybody who's even a suffix sakana should eat, but he himself didn't eat. Now, be that as it may, because l'chayri he did eat. Be that as it may, leaving that aside, Rav Shlomo Zalman has a second akudah that he also addresses in Shmir Shabbat Kachasa, and it's brought down in Halicha Shleima, is that Rav Shlomo Zalman says that when it's a suffix sakana, a person's allowed to be machmer. Meaning this that we say that by sakana pikuach nefesh, you're a shaitif yemachmer and initial is maguna and you have to do it. That's only by avadei sakana. But potentially by something like this, which is only a suffix sakana, there's makom to be machmer. Now, potentially, that is what Rabbi Yisroel Salanter's detractors held, meaning even though they're aware of this Magen Avram and the Chasam Sofer and etc., they held this was not a circumstance that was a Vadei Sakana. This is a Suffix Sakana, and by a Suffix Sakana in Yom Kippur, you don't just rush to be Mekel. You have to treat it, with a little more Chamiris and be Machmer. And this seemingly is what they held, because Rabbi Tzalal HaKohen in Reishis Bikurim, in his Sefer Reishis Bikurim, he writes, and I want to read this for you because it's very interesting. In Reishis Bikurim, in Simon Tes, he writes as follows. He says, "V'reisi lahasker b'dvar ma shekasav hagoyin b'al Chasam Sofer zal b'simul chav gimel." He's referring to this Chasam Sofer, and obviously by default, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter as well. He says, "Im yesh lismech al dvar Magen Avram b'simul tafkuf ayin vav simchat and beis." Regard to this Chasam Sofer, if there's makam to be samech on this Magen Avram, he says, "Gam v'yem tzim kippur mazeh chas v'shalom ayin sham." Hey, aleinu lo hidia. This is the punchline. He says, "I want to share with you hadavar hagadol hazel l'deiris." This great thing that happened. I want the generations to know this. L'deiris olam v'ezes Shem Yisbarach Hashem. But klasa zimni 3 times during my tenure as Dayan of Vilna, chazaka me'alafim v'revavas anashim v'nashim asher teisilanu hisanu kulam b'tzei megadol. I have proof from thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of men and women who during these times of pandemic fasted on Yom Kippur. He says Yom Kippur Shnas Taf Kuf Tzadik Beis, Yom Kippur Taf Reish Tes, that's the one that we're talking about, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, and Yom Kippur and Taf Reish Chav Zayin, B'chol Medina Seinu Oz, in all of our city, V'lei Kara Lahem Kol Rach Halila, nothing bad happened to them. V'noida Zois Kemat B'chol Ha'olam Oz. This was news, he said, this was like national news, that nothing happened to all the people who fasted. There's nothing that we could prove that had been tested better than this, that people didn't die from fasting. And like this was known to everybody who was involved in the Pikuach Nefesh at the time. On Yom Kippur, nobody became sick through fasting in Yom Kippur. Now, I do have to say, he has a caveat. And the caveat is makes it a little bit, hard to run with this. He says, "Rak, the only ones who got sick was la'oisena anashim shlei nizru b'nafsheiseim az b'achilasam u'b'shtiyasam u'malu kreisam b'dvarim akashim l'guf az b'erev Yom Kippurim." He says people who weren't careful what they ate in Erev Yom Kippur, they ate hard food or hard drink on Erev Yom Kippur, those people, some of them became sick on Yom Kippur from fasting. V'chol shegem b'moitzi Yom Kippur, if they didn't eat correctly after Yom Kippur, sha'az tarach shmir Rabbi v'yosei kanoida. So he says there was, of course, some people who became sick, but they were people who weren't cautious before and after. So Mameli says, "V'alkein imki b'dalad seimis." It's possible to be seimich yeshlismach al Magen Avram zal hanal ulam b'tzeim kippurim on Yom Kippur chalil letzaref lismachaz chas v'shalom al divrei Magen Avram hanal b'zem u'maklav Hashem yiracham aleinu. This is what he says. So Rabbi Tzalal HaKohen is clearly making a distinction over here, and he's saying that this that you tell me that it's considered a sakana and we don't make fasts, that's not to make additional fasts. Because over there, you don't really have such a great chiv. It's not one of the actual calendar fasts in the Jewish calendar. Navas, it's the chiv medina, the Mishnah, to make an extra fast for Rachamim. So b'chiyai gavna, that it's a suffix sakana, you stay away from it. But by something like this, where it's Yom Kippur, where it's a chiv, they rise at the fast. So if it's just a suffix sakana, you have to be machmir about it, you have to fast. And he says that I'm telling you, badik menusa chazaka from thousands of people over 3 different cycles of plague that nobody died. Now granted, he caveats it by saying that some people did die, and some people did get sick. And Rabbi Yisroel Salanter would tell you, yes, that's why I said everyone should eat, because it's impossible for a large tzibur of tens of thousands of people to be nizar perfectly, that every single person is going to eat only the right things at the right time. It's impossible. Muzdach, we have to be makel for them, because otherwise it's going to lead to great sakana. Now, what's interesting is that the Stei Chamed, in Marachas Yom Kippurim, in Simon Gimel Eis Daled, he brings from this Reishis Bikurim, he quotes it, and he also brings another interesting, from the Sefer Yisroel, about a Magefa that happened in Yerushalayim in the year Tafresh Chavav, which is 1866. Again, a Magefa of cholera. And in the Sefer Yisroel, it writes as follows. It says, Mikol Makim Tsamu Kulam B'Yom Kippurim. Everybody fasted. V'leimeis Echad B'Yomu. Nobody died on that day. Vayehi Adavar L'Nes Be'enei Amim. It was like a nes for the people watching. That nobody died. And now, I saw, so him also, he's quoting the Reishis Bikurim, he's quoting another anecdotal evidence of the same to show that when the people were machmer not to die, it was far from a given that they were going to die in Yom Kippur if they didn't eat. It was a suffix sakana, a small tzad of sakana perhaps, and therefore not something that you needed to run to be makel about. Now, I did see there's a sefer Mishnah Pikuach Nefesh from Rabbi Yosef Lawrence, the Chaver Knesset, Shlomo Lawrence's son, was just reprinted, a very, very chashuv sefer on the Yanam of Pikuach Nefesh, where he raises like a very simple question. He says, I don't understand. Ein Seim Chanal Anetz. The halacha with pikuach nefesh always is that if there's this shaila of sakana, you mechal Shabbos right away. You don't say, I'm going to be saying a nes is going to happen. He says, look at this, the Sefer Yisroel. He's saying himself, a hayir adav nes. It was like a nes. Haytachan to say to be makel on something that's a nes. So he tells too the Shlomo Zalman that we're referencing. He says, Achin yoyim Sefer Shmir Shabbos Gilchasa that he brings from Shlomo Zalman. The makom that rak chash muat the sakana mut lahachmer v'latzim v'lisma chad Hashem mitzvah yed davra. Shlomo Zalman brings that makom it's only a suffix sakana, a small sakana you're allowed to. He says, Ula, you could say that this is not considered a mamish, a major pikuach nefesh, and therefore there was makom to be makel. He also brings, and this is a famous thing, we've spoken about this in the past, that the Chazon Ish in his Chuvas Uksavim, in Sim Mem Ches Oisvav, he says as follows, that there are things that are rachik mi pikuach nefesh, v'adavar talik if imidas habitachin, ha'machmer in moichem biyadei. Ulam l'inyan hira l'rabim yesh l'hiris kedim pikuach nefesh. The Chazon Ish has this very interesting idea. The Chazon Ish says that pikuach nefesh is very gray. Chazon Ish says if you want to really be making about pikuach nefesh, you could have everyone go to work, he says. Because if they're not going to work on Shabbos, they're not going to have parnasa, they're going to starve, they're going to die. He says, Elamai, hadav nitin l'chachamim, to figure out. It's very, very not simple, not clear, what exactly the exact parameters of pikuach nefesh is. The Chazon Ish says, I'll read you the words. He says, tzarech b'zeh, zehirus yiseira behetet the pikuach nefesh. Because it's a shikal adas, he says. This shikal adas of what is considered pikuach nefesh and what isn't, is a davar that needs zehirus kedayla. And the Chayr, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter and Rabbi Salih Akayin, the Vilna Bezdin, were gufa arguing about this particular shikal adas, on this exact shikal adas of how do you perceive this? Do we say this is something that's too public, too large, and therefore could lead to too much danger? Or do we say no? Individuals will do what's appropriate for them. People who have a sakana will talk to Bezdin, but they'll get a pratistic a heter, but to make a heter for everybody, that's a bridge too far. Now this is all understanding the pashas that Rabbi Yisroel was handling, the idea of suffix sakana to each individual, even to the healthy individuals. There is a second way to understand it, and this is from some of the other chuvas that discuss it. They have a whole second way of discussing it, and that's as follows, that Rabbi Yisroel was afraid as follows, that if he told, let's say he would get up and he'd make an announcement, he'd say, anybody who has symptoms of cholera, or was exposed to someone who has symptoms of cholera, or thinks they might have cholera, should be makel and not fast. But all those who are healthy and don't have any issues, it's a regular tainus, you mechuyev to fast. He says, what would happen? What would end up happening is that a good amount of people would say, hey, Tachan, I'm gonna be makel, not to fast in Yom Kippur. I'm sure my exposure wasn't real. It's not so dangerous. I'll be fine. So in order to prevent people from being machmer on themselves, to prevent chaylim from being machmer on themselves, he felt you have to be makel, a large kula for everybody, so there should be no shame and no makom to be makel. Now this is like a much more executive decision, a grace Indian, grace chiddush that Rabbi Yisroel was saying, is that since he was afraid that people who were a little bit were sick, or were mechoyev really to be makel for themselves and not fast, wouldn't do it, he had to be makel for everybody. Now, there is a tzushtel from a tshuva from the Merel Diskin, where he brings a raya from a Taisus in Sanhedrin, Daf Chavav Mid Aleph, that Taisus says that they were mater charisha and shvius because of pikuach nefesh, because the aniyim wouldn't have what to eat, they wouldn't be able to pay the taxes to the melech, and they'll die. And the Merel Diskin learns from there that even ashirim were allowed to do charisha and shvius, meaning the heter of charisha and shvius, to plow on shvius, was mutter for everybody, because we're afraid that the poor people wouldn't be able to get b'zach eitzah, and they'd end up not having what to give to the melech. So frek Merel Diskin, same thing. Why don't you just make a heter for people that need the heter and leave it usher for the people it's usher? Elamai says the Merel Diskin, you see that if you make a heter partial and you say only if you're in a real pinch you could be makel, we have to be chayshish that people are going to want to be machmer themselves and they're not going to go through with it. And in order to prevent that, the way the Merel Diskin's understanding Taisvis, Chazal were makel for everybody. So, there you have precedent for Rabbi Yisroel Salanter's rationale. You see that even though for the healthy people it was perfectly okay for them to fast and there was no chash sakana, should they not be eating, some people who are really ill would also take it upon themselves to be machmer and not eat. Therefore, Yisroel felt that was enough of a reason to be makel for everybody, which is a meridik chiddush, and one could imagine why that would cause consternation amongst the place and make a big machlekes. Now, incidentally, there's like another footnote to this, and this is like a clever zach, is that Yisroel Salanter's, I don't know if it's his son himself. I think his son himself, when he retells the story, or others, they say that Yisroel had an interesting idea. What he instructed the Ilam was to make a neder before Yom Kippur starts and say, I'm making a neder not to eat, a kazayas of food on this upcoming day. Now, they have a neder not to eat already, so ein iser chal iser, the iser of Yom Kippur won't be chal on them. and on the Darim there's no Chatzi Shir. Only for Yom Kippur there's Chatzi Shir, and like that they could eat Pachas Mishir each time, and there's no Isser of Chatzi Shir for them, and they could all break their fast. Now, not every place that brings this chap that Yisroel says, and there's makom l'sfakech if this chap even works, but it's an interesting addendum to the program. Meaning, it means that Yisroel was being much more clever about it and being machmer in a certain sense. Everyone should eat with shiurim, and he had some sort of einfall to avoid the circumstance. Now, in any case, this is the incredible story and the incredible shayla that ensued, and the different various sadim had explained the two shittas over here. Now, just postscript, and I'm not going to go into this now, but maybe for a later date, is in most of the versions that retell the story, it has a Yisroel Salanter making kiddush on Yom Kippur before he eats. Now, food for thought, obviously, what would be the nusach for kiddush on Yom Kippur? We don't know of a kiddush on Yom Kippur. There is no nusach for kiddush on Yom Kippur. And in general, if someone is ill or sick or katan is eating, do they make kiddush on Yom Kippur? What would kiddush look like? What would it be? So there's a lot of raid about this, and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik supposedly had a nusach for kiddush on Yom Kippur, and there's what to talk about. We'll save that in Mitzvah Shem for a later date.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.